welcome everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again for another Curious Monday with our weekly dose of inspiration here at Hyper Island. And today, I want to talk about Agile. I think largely it's going to be about how Agile is way, way more than just a method. My name is Yeng Wai, and I'm a Master's Program Director as well as Learning Designer here at Hyper Island. The first thing I'm going to just say is that I've been looking at some of this, the data and statistics and stuff like that. And just a quick, report that was done, I think last year, it's like the State of Agile report. And when I think almost 10,000 people were surveyed, and they're saying, tell us more about whether your company is practicing Agile and how many have adopted Agile. And we look at it, it says that over half of respondents say that either a majority or all of their company has adopted Agile of some sort. So that's quite a bit of growth and development ever since, I think, 2001, when the Agile manifesto was created, and 2008, where I think Forbes magazine talks about how Agile is going to be the next big transformational management practice. In the same report, it talked about how when it comes to Agile, right, lots of people use Scrum. That's a very familiar methodology, perhaps. A number of use Kanban. There's some that use this hybrid called a Scrumban, so they take best practices of others. And when you look at some of the techniques and practices that they use, right, daily stand-ups, that's a big one, retrospectives and sprint planning, those are very, very popular techniques and practices, more than 80%. And when it comes to some tools, they use Kanban boards, they use task boards or spreadsheets. So about 70% of people use some kind of tool to visualize their work. But when you think about it, there's still lots of challenges. And these challenges that you see here are not new, okay? They're not new in any way. In fact, they're very, very familiar. And there are some of these you kind of identify with as well. I'm just gonna highlight these ones. Organizational culture, resistance to change, leadership support or sponsorship. And the last one right at the bottom, about 22% say unwillingness to admit mistakes and learn. Those are still very significant challenges. And so when I thought about it, it led me to go back to the Agile manifesto and the Agile principles and the values. And when you look at this list, right, this is a really familiar list if you are in the whole Agile community. Individuals' interactions with processes and tools, right? That's the first one that's always mentioned. And when it comes to the principles, there are actually several principles as I studied it that talk very little about process and a lot more about people, a lot more about team, a lot more about culture, a lot more about how people work. And so I think that led me to think, you know what? Agile is, yes, there's processes and there's tools, but there's also a lot that has to do with people. A lot to do with, how teams work, a lot to do with, facilitation and coaching and all the wonderful things that we kind of talk about at Hyper Island. And so when you look at, so for example, just the principles of the 12 principles, 6 of them have to do with some kind of learning behavior or team behavior. I think that's why many organizations find it hard to really implement Agile successfully, because it's not so much a process and tools, but really, it's about individuals and interactions. And with that comes, frankly, the way teams work. And so, we talk about welcoming change, right? Working together and collaborating, supporting, trusting, motivating, having face-to-face conversations is a really nice one in the whole, remote work, hybrid work kind of conversations many companies are having now. Developing self-organizing teams, the ability to reflect and adjust. I just couldn't help but, think about how at Hyper Island, when we do Way Week, when we do leading teams, we want to talk about all these different characteristics because, and I'm convinced now, when you want to do Agile properly, you're going to need strong teams. Teams that work well together, teams that know how to collaborate, but I think more importantly, teams that are highly motivated. And obviously that begs the next question then, okay, so what are these strong teams like? And what do the strong teams need? There are some traits of strong teams, and I'm sure if I asked you, you could probably tell me about them as well. But when I think about strong teams, I think about these few things, okay? We tend to look at the research, but more than that, I've also, through many conversations with corporates and organizations, having attended, Scrum trainings of my own, talking to different Scrum masters, I think it's quite safe to say that a strong team, right? Strong teams, they have good communication, there's transparency, there is trust, there is skill, and there's autonomy. Now, more specifically, there is open communication, the ability to speak freely, but there's also equal communication, so no one dominating voice. You have transparency around, clarity of work, for example, what they're expected to do, or clarity of purpose, right? Transparency around the clarity of purpose and being driven by that. There's also transparency around progress that's being made. And that's why many Agile teams use tools like Kanban boards or, shared spreadsheets to track progress and see how progress is being made. And transparency is very important. Part of strong teams also involve trust. And I think we talk about trust in a very big way at Hyper Island. I still remember, right at the beginning of Way, we talk about the openness and trust spiral and how having that trust leads to teams working well together. And obviously the research has been bearing it out for the last 5 to 7 years, right? Lots of talk around psychological safety. But to add to that, the point about no one blaming the culture, but rather accepting mistakes as a team, okay? And also the no bad ideas, or as we've been likened to call it recently in our master's modules, we want to have no stupid questions, right? No stupid questions, no bad ideas. These teams need to have trust, and trust is often seen in these 3 ways. But more than that, strong teams are also very skillful teams. They're skillful not just in their jobs and their roles, and that's obviously to be expected, but they're very skillful in also problem solving and decision making. And if I were to lump these 2 things together, usually problem solving when there's a problem or when there's a decision to be made, that's usually when conflicts arise. And so I put to you that strong teams also are very skillful in resolving conflicts. Many people talk about the Tuckman model, right? The forming and storming and norming and performing. And sometimes we assume that when the team is in that high performing stage, that they no longer have any conflicts. I'm of a different opinion. I think I've seen enough of teams to know that actually, even in the high performing team, there will be some point of conflict. But the important thing to know here is that these teams are very skillful in resolving conflict. They're very skillful in maybe methodically breaking down a problem and pulling it apart and being able to analyze it well, knowing maybe figuring out where the issue is, and then going in and making a decision on how to solve it. I think that actually what sets apart high performing teams from those that are still struggling. The ones that are struggling sometimes allow the conflict to consume them, and they're paralyzed and they can't move on. So that skill of resolving conflict is actually a really powerful skill. Lastly, I think strong teams have autonomy. It's bearing out in the in how Agile talks about a self-organizing team. But to break it down a bit further, there is therefore a sense of ownership, but also self-leadership when it comes to how the teams work. So when I think about Agile, I think about it as being more than just a method. I'm very convinced now that, in fact, I've been saying for quite a while now, that unless you have strong teams, you're not going to have a successful or even Agile transformation or an Agile team. It all comes down to how well the team works together. And if I'm going to take these 5, right, and just attempt to kind of map it to the Agile principles, just to show you, when we talk about communication, yes, it's face-to-face conversations. If it's transparency, it's about the ability to reflect and to adjust. If it's trust, then it's supporting, trusting, and motivating teams. If it's skill, it's about how they welcome change when change is on their door, and how do they adapt and pivot to that. But also, how do they work together, right? So resolve conflict, like I said earlier. How do they collaborate well? And autonomy, yes, developing self-organizing teams. So yeah, that's really my little sharing in a nutshell. I want to just maybe kind of keep pushing that message that while we must learn about the the processes, and if you're using Scrum, then the Scrum ceremonies and how Scrum teams should work, and cross-functional teams and those are all very, very good. But when it comes to making making Agile truly successful, I'm going to be looking at the team. I'm going to be looking at Scrum Masters and how they facilitate the teams, how they coach the teams, and how do they help these teams communicate better, have transparency, right? Have a strong sense of trust within the team, be very skillful in working together, problem solving, decision making, conflict resolution, and also how much of the project or how much of the team owns the project, the sense of ownership, and the ability to lead themselves in the right direction. Perhaps my last question then is, how might we build strong teams? Perhaps some of you have fantastic ideas of how to build strong teams. Love to hear from you. And looking forward once again to seeing you next week. See ya.